At 8:17 in the morning, Thomas Norton made a decision that terrified him more than staying silent. He looked up at the janitor beside him, opened his mouth, and wondered if speaking would break the world again. 9 months of silence hung between them like glass. Michael West didn't move, didn't smile, didn't rush him. He simply waited, the way no one else had bothered to wait. What happened next would shatter a billionaire's empire, expose a janitor's buried past, and prove that sometimes the quietest rooms hold the loudest truths. Before we continue, before Thomas speaks, you need to know what he's afraid of. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like. If you've ever held a truth in your throat for too long, this story is for you. Stay with me. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because this isn't just the moment Thomas finally spoke, it's the moment everything he thought he knew collapses. The hallway at Hawthorne Ridge Preparatory Academy smelled like lemon cleaner and old textbooks. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes children look smaller than they are. Thomas Norton sat with his back pressed against locker number 47, his blue polo shirt wrinkled, his khaki pants dusty from the floor. His hands gripped his knees so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He stared at the polished tile in front of him, watching the distorted reflections of students walking past. None of them stopped. Teachers had tried everything over the past 9 months. So had the child psychologists flown in from Boston. So had the trauma specialists from Palo Alto, who charged more per hour than most families earned in a week. The school counselor had 17 documented intervention attempts in her files. None of them produced a single word. Not a whisper, not a sound. Down the hall, a maintenance cart rolled into view. Yellow plastic bucket, grey mop handle, wheels that squeaked just slightly on the turn near the science wing. Michael West pushed it with the steady rhythm of someone who had cleaned these floors so many times he could do it with his eyes closed. He was supposed to finish the East Wing by 9:30, then move to the library before lunch period. But Michael stopped when he saw the boy. Not because Thomas looked upset. He didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't call for help. Michael stopped because he recognized something in the way Thomas held himself. The particular kind of stillness that comes when a child has stopped believing that anyone is really listening. The way a body folds in on itself when it's trying to disappear. Michael had seen it before, a long time ago, in a different hallway, in a different state. Instead of walking past like the teachers did, instead of calling the office like protocol required, Michael West did something that would change both their lives. He parked the yellow cart against the wall. He walked over slowly, footsteps deliberate so they wouldn't startle. And then he lowered himself down onto the cold tile floor and sat beside Thomas Norton, his back against the same row of lockers. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't tell Thomas everything would be okay. He didn't pull out his phone to call someone more qualified. Michael simply sat there, present, still, waiting. 3 minutes passed in silence, then 5, then 7. Students walked by, glancing down with confusion. A teacher slowed, looked at Michael with disapproval, then kept walking. The clock above the water fountain ticked forward, marking time that felt both endless and impossibly brief. And then, at 8:17 in the morning, something impossible happened. Thomas Norton turned his head, just slightly, and looked at the man beside him. Really looked at him. Not past him, not through him, but at him. Michael met his eyes and nodded once, a gesture so small it could have been missed. Thomas took a breath. It would be 2 more weeks before anyone understood why a janitor succeeded where every expert had failed. 2 more weeks before the truth about Thomas's silence came crashing into his father's carefully controlled world. 2 more weeks before Michael West's own buried past surfaced in ways that would force everyone to question what they thought they knew. But in that moment, on that cold hallway floor, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was that for the first time in 9 months, Thomas Norton felt like someone was actually listening, even though neither of them had said a word. This is where the story truly begins. Not with the silence, but with everything that led to it. Not with the moment Thomas stopped speaking, but with the night that made him believe his voice could destroy the people he loved most. To understand what happened in that hallway, you need to know what happened 9 months earlier in a house in Aspen, Colorado, when a boy screamed for his parents to stop fighting. And you need to know why, hours later, his mother never came home. 9 months earlier, Thomas Norton had been a different child. He laughed at cartoons, asked questions about dinosaurs, complained about broccoli at dinner. He spoke in full sentences, sometimes too many of them, the way 8-year-olds do when they're trying to explain something they find fascinating. Then, overnight, the words stopped. His father noticed first, not because he was paying attention, but because the silence made meetings easier. Calder Norton was on a conference call with investors in Singapore when he realized his son hadn't interrupted him in 3 days. He mentioned it to the nanny, who mentioned it to the private school headmaster, who scheduled an appointment with the school psychologist. Dr. Vanessa Brennan sat across from Thomas in her office in suburban Lake Forest, a room painted soft beige with motivational posters about growth and resilience. She had 17 years of experience with children from wealthy families. She used play therapy, cognitive behavioral techniques, and patience. Thomas stared at the carpet and said nothing. After 6 sessions, Dr. Brennan wrote in her notes that Thomas exhibited selective mutism, likely triggered by situational anxiety. She recommended further evaluation. Calder Norton hired someone better. Dr. Raymond Peterson flew in from Manhattan, a child psychiatrist who treated the children of senators and CEOs. He met Thomas in the penthouse office of Norton Industries, 47 floors above Midtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline. Thomas sat in a leather chair that made him look even smaller. Dr. Peterson asked questions in a voice designed to sound comforting. He mentioned Thomas's mother only once, gently, watching for a reaction. Thomas's face didn't change. He folded his hands in his lap and looked past Dr. Peterson toward the window. After 3 sessions, Dr. Peterson suggested trauma-focused therapy and possibly medication. He said some children retreated inward after loss, that grief could manifest as communication shutdown, that time and consistency might help. Calder Norton didn't like words like might and possibly. He wanted guarantees. He called a clinic outside Palo Alto. Dr. Iris Kwan ran a private treatment center that specialized in childhood trauma and attachment disorders. She had published 2 books and appeared on morning talk shows. Her clinic cost more per week than most people's annual salary. Thomas spent 11 days there. The facility looked like a resort, all glass and natural wood, gardens designed to feel therapeutic. Dr. Kwan used art therapy, music therapy, equine therapy. She had Thomas draw pictures, play instruments, brush horses in a stable that smelled like hay and leather. Thomas participated quietly. He drew pictures when asked. He touched the piano keys when prompted. He stood near the horses and stroked their manes. He didn't speak. Dr. Kwan called Calder Norton on the 12th day and said Thomas needed long-term residential care, possibly 6 months, maybe longer. She said his silence was deeply rooted. That breakthrough would require intensive intervention and patience. Calder Norton pulled his son out that afternoon. Back in Illinois, the school adjusted. Teachers stopped calling on Thomas in class. They marked him present, documented his assignments as incomplete, noted his behavior as non-compliant. The word appeared 11 times in his file over 4 months. Non-compliant, as if silence were a choice, as if a child who wouldn't speak was simply refusing to follow instructions. Calder Norton attended one parent-teacher conference. He arrived in a black town car, 23 minutes late, wearing a suit that cost more than the teacher's monthly rent. He listened to their concerns with his phone face down on the table, checked it twice, and said he would handle it privately. He never attended another conference. Thomas became a problem that everyone acknowledged, but no one could solve. A case file that grew thicker. A child who existed in the margins of conversations between adults who spoke about him like he wasn't there. The teachers developed a quiet relief when Thomas was absent. It meant one less failure in the room, one less reminder that some children couldn't be reached, no matter how many degrees hung on the wall or how much money their parents spent. On the morning Michael West sat beside Thomas in the hallway, it had been 274 days since anyone had heard his voice. 274 days since anyone had asked him what he needed instead of what was wrong with him. 274 days since anyone had simply sat beside him and waited, until a janitor with a yellow cart and a past nobody knew decided that presence mattered more than protocol. Michael West knew what silence looked like long before he met Thomas Norton. He grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, in a house where his father came home from the steel mill and sat in a chair by the window without speaking. Some nights the silence lasted hours. Other nights it lasted until morning. His mother learned not to ask questions, Michael learned not to make noise. By the time he was 12, Michael understood that some people went quiet because the world had become too loud inside their heads. That silence wasn't always refusal. Sometimes it was survival. He learned to read the small signs. The way his father's jaw tightened when the mill laid off another shift. The way his mother's hands moved faster when she was anxious, chopping vegetables with rhythm that had nothing to do with cooking. The way his younger sister Corinne stopped laughing 3 months after their father started drinking. Michael learned that pushing someone to speak before they were ready only made the walls thicker. So when he sat beside Thomas Norton that first morning, he didn't ask questions because questions demanded answers. He didn't offer comfort because comfort assumed he understood. He simply sat and let the boy decide what happened next. 3 days later, Michael saw Thomas in the same hallway during 4th period. The boy was supposed to be in math class. Instead, he sat against the lockers again, small and still, like he was trying to become invisible. Michael pushed his cart past slowly. He didn't sit this time. He just nodded once, a gesture that said, "I see you," and kept moving. Thomas watched him go. The next week, it happened again. Thomas in the hallway during 2nd period, knees pulled up, hands clasped. Michael was mopping near the water fountain. He worked his way down the hall, steady and unhurried, until he reached the spot where Thomas sat. He paused, wrung out the mop, and said quietly, "You're allowed to be here." Thomas looked up. Michael kept mopping. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need one. He finished the section and moved on, leaving Thomas alone but not abandoned. The interactions were small, brief, easily missed by anyone not paying attention. But someone was paying attention. Charlene Voss, the vice principal, noticed first. She saw Michael talking to Thomas near the lockers one morning and made a note in her daily log. Possible inappropriate contact with student. She mentioned it to Boyd Hendricks, the assistant superintendent, who mentioned it to the school counselor. Dr. Brennan, who had tried and failed to reach Thomas herself, felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest when she heard a janitor was making progress where she couldn't. She told herself it was concern for proper protocol. She didn't admit, even to herself, that it felt like failure. The teachers noticed too. They saw Michael sitting with Thomas during lunch period, not speaking, just present. They saw Thomas watching Michael work, following his movements down the hallway with something that almost looked like trust. Gwendolyn Marsh, a 4th grade teacher with 22 years of experience, mentioned it in the staff lounge. "It's inappropriate," she said, stirring her coffee. "He's not trained. He doesn't have clearance to work with students like that." No one disagreed loudly enough to matter. The truth was simpler than any of them wanted to admit. Michael West wasn't doing anything remarkable. He wasn't using techniques or interventions or therapeutic frameworks. He was just showing up, sitting down, being present without asking for anything in return. And it was working. That was the problem. Because if a janitor with no credentials and no training could reach Thomas Norton when all their degrees and expertise had failed, what did that say about them? So when Charlene Voss sat in her office on a Thursday afternoon and typed up a formal report, she told herself it was about protecting the child, about maintaining professional boundaries, about following proper channels. She didn't admit it was about protecting her own certainty that some problems required experts. The report went to the headmaster's desk by 3:15 that afternoon. Subject line: unauthorized staff interaction with silent student. By 4 o'clock, Michael West was called into the administrative office. By 4:30, Thomas Norton's father received a phone call that would change everything. The call wasn't about his son finally showing signs of connection. It was about a janitor who needed to be dealt with. Calder Norton received the call during a board meeting in Manhattan. Norton Industries was finalizing a merger with a tech firm in Seattle worth $3.7 billion. 12 people sat around a glass table on the 47th floor, watching him negotiate terms that would reshape the telecommunications industry. His phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. Hawthorne Ridge Preparatory Academy. He ignored it. The phone vibrated again 30 seconds later. Same caller. Calder excused himself and stepped into the hallway, his Italian leather shoes silent on the marble floor. "This is Norton." Headmaster Preston Whitlock spoke carefully, the way people do when delivering bad news to someone who signs large checks. "Mr. Norton, we have a situation involving Thomas. Nothing dangerous, but it requires your immediate attention." Calder checked his watch. "I'm in the middle of something." Can this wait until tomorrow? It involves a staff member acting outside protocol. We felt you should be informed before we proceed with disciplinary action. Calder's jaw tightened. What kind of staff member? A janitor, sir. He's been spending time with Thomas during school hours. Unsupervised contact. We've documented multiple instances. The word janitor hung in the air like an insult. I'll be there in 3 hours, Calder said, and ended the call. He walked back into the boardroom, made his apologies, and had his assistant reschedule the rest of the week. By the time his driver pulled up to the building entrance, Calder had already decided how this would end. Some problems required experts. Some required lawyers. Some just required money and the willingness to use it. The black Mercedes arrived at Hawthorne Ridge Preparatory Academy at 2:45 in the afternoon. Calder Norton stepped out wearing a charcoal suit tailored in London, a white shirt pressed to mathematical precision, and a watch that cost more than most people earned in a year. He looked like a man who solved problems by writing checks or making calls to people who owed him favors. Preston Whitlock met him in the administrative wing, a nervous smile fixed on his face. Charlene Voss stood beside him, holding a manila folder thick with documentation. Mr. Norton, thank you for coming so quickly. Calder didn't waste time with pleasantries. Tell me exactly what happened. They led him to a conference room with windows overlooking the athletic fields. Charlene laid out the folder. Inside were photos taken by staff members. Michael West, sitting beside Thomas in the hallway. Michael mopping while Thomas watched. Michael at the edge of the cafeteria while Thomas ate lunch alone. This individual has had multiple unauthorized interactions with your son, Charlene said. He's not certified to work with students. He has no training in childhood psychology or trauma response. Frankly, we're concerned about liability. Calder studied the photos. A middle-aged man in a grey maintenance uniform, salt and pepper hair, weathered hands, the kind of person Calder passed every day without seeing. What's his name? Michael West. What do we know about him? Preston shifted uncomfortably. He's been with us for 3 years. Solid work record. No complaints until now. But given the circumstances, we thought it best to run a background check. And? We're still waiting on the full report. But there are some sealed records from Pennsylvania. We can't access them without proper authorization. Calder felt the familiar surge of control returning. This was fixable. Everything was fixable with the right resources. Get the authorization. I want to know everything. Employment history, criminal record, why he's cleaning floors instead of doing whatever he did before. Everything. Yes, sir. Where's Thomas now? In class. Calder wanted to ask if Thomas had spoken yet, if this janitor had somehow succeeded where everyone else failed, but he didn't ask because he already knew the answer. If Thomas had spoken, they would have led with that information. I want this person removed from campus by tomorrow morning, Calder said. Pay him whatever severance is required. Have him sign an NDA. Make it go away. Preston nodded quickly. Of course. We'll handle it immediately. Calder stood to leave, already mentally returning to the merger talks in Manhattan, but Charlene spoke up, her voice hesitant. Mr. Norton, there's one more thing. The background check came back with something unusual. What? Michael West used to be a licensed therapist. The room went quiet. Calder turned slowly. What? In Pennsylvania. Family therapy. His license was revoked about 7 years ago. The records are sealed, but the state registry confirms it. For the first time in years, Calder Norton felt something shift beneath his carefully controlled world. A janitor who used to be a therapist, sitting beside his son, making progress where everyone else had failed. Find out why he lost his license, Calder said quietly. Find out everything. Michael West became a family therapist because his own family had needed one and never got it. He earned his license in Pennsylvania in 2003, opened a small practice in Scranton, and spent 12 years working with children who had learned to hide their pain behind silence or anger or perfect behavior. He was good at his job, patient, observant, willing to sit in uncomfortable silence until the truth found its way out. In 2015, a mother brought her 14-year-old daughter to his office. The girl had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped talking to anyone at home. She sat in Michael's office and stared at the floor for 3 sessions before she finally spoke. She told him about the residential treatment center where she'd spent 6 months, about the staff members who used restraints as punishment, about the isolation rooms where children were locked for hours, about the fear that lived in every corner of that place. Michael believed her. He made calls, asked questions, found 3 other families with similar stories, children who came home from Riverside Recovery Center with new traumas layered over old ones. He reported it to the state licensing board. He testified in court. He told the truth, clearly and completely, even when the lawyers for Riverside Recovery tried to discredit him, even when they suggested he was fabricating claims to build his practice, even when they dug into his own childhood, looking for ammunition. The case dragged on for 2 years. Riverside Recovery had money. They had lawyers from Philadelphia who specialized in making problems disappear. They had connections to state politicians who'd voted to approve their facility in the first place. Michael had the truth. It wasn't enough. The facility was fined $60,000 and allowed to remain open under new management. 2 staff members were fired. The rest kept their jobs. The children who'd been hurt received no compensation, no apology, no acknowledgement that the system had failed them. But Michael lost everything. The lawsuit cost him his savings. His malpractice insurance didn't cover whistleblowing. His wife, Judith, who'd supported him at first, grew tired of the legal bills and the stress and the way their phone rang at midnight with threats from people who wanted him to shut up. She filed for divorce in 2017. His license was revoked 6 months later, not because he'd done anything wrong with his patients, but because the state board decided his testimony had violated confidentiality agreements, even though the law explicitly protected whistleblowers. The decision was political. Everyone knew it, but no one said it out loud. Michael West, who'd spent 12 years helping children, was suddenly unemployable in the only profession he'd ever wanted. He moved to Illinois because Pennsylvania felt like a graveyard. He took the first job he could find that didn't require references or explanations. Cleaning floors was honest work. It didn't pay much. It didn't require him to carry anyone else's pain, and nobody asked about his past because nobody cared. Until a silent boy sat in a hallway, and Michael couldn't walk past him. By the time Calder Norton's lawyers pulled the full story from sealed court records, Michael had already been escorted off campus. He turned in his keys, his uniform, his ID badge. Preston Whitlock delivered the news in a windowless office with all the warmth of a termination notice. "We appreciate your service, but given your history and the concerns raised, we feel it's best if you don't return." Michael didn't argue. He knew how this worked. Money always won. He went home to his 1-bedroom apartment in Evanston, made coffee, and sat by the window watching traffic move past on the street below. He thought about Thomas, about the way the boy had started to look up when Michael entered the hallway, about the small nod Thomas had given him 2 days ago, the first gesture of acknowledgement in 9 months. Michael knew what it felt like to speak the truth and lose everything. He wondered if Thomas knew that staying silent could cost just as much. The next morning, Michael woke to an email from the school counselor, Dr. Brennan. The subject line read, "Urgent situation involving Thomas Norton." Inside was a scanned image. A drawing. A boy standing alone inside a house made of glass. Outside, a crowd with no faces. Above them, a tall figure holding a rectangle that might have been a phone. The figure's hand reached down but stopped short of touching the boy. Dr. Brennan's message was brief. "Thomas slid this across the table during our session this morning. He looked toward the door like he was hoping you'd walk in. I thought you should see it." Michael stared at the drawing for a long time. Then he opened a new email, typed Calder Norton's address that he'd found in a school directory months ago, and wrote one sentence. "Your son thinks his voice broke something that can't be fixed." He hit send before he could second-guess it. 3 hours later, his phone rang. The number had a New York area code. Michael let it ring twice before answering. "This is Michael West." The voice on the other end was controlled, cold, and carrying the weight of power that assumed obedience. "This is Calder Norton. We need to talk." Michael stared at the drawing for 20 minutes before he understood what Thomas was really saying. The glass house wasn't transparent because the boy wanted to be seen. It was transparent because he had no walls left, no protection. Everyone could watch him, but no one could reach him. The faceless crowd wasn't anonymous strangers. They were everyone who'd tried to help. Therapists, doctors, teachers, all blurred together into a mass of failed attempts. No individual faces, because none of them had really looked at him as a person. And the figure above them, the tall man with the phone, that was the part that made Michael's chest tighten. The hand reaching down but not touching, The phone held like a barrier between father and son, the height difference exaggerated, making the man tower over everything, powerful and distant at the same time. Thomas had drawn his father as a giant who couldn't bend low enough to reach him. Or wouldn't. Michael saved the image, closed his laptop, and tried to imagine what it took for a child to communicate that kind of loneliness through pencil and paper. 1,400 miles away in Manhattan, Calder Norton sat in his home office at 11:40 at night. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park. The city glowed below him, millions of lights that made the darkness feel temporary. He'd read Michael's email 17 times. Your son thinks his voice broke something that can't be fixed. Each time, the words landed differently. First with anger, then confusion, then something that felt uncomfortably close to recognition. Calder opened the attachment Dr. Brennan had forwarded, the drawing Thomas had made. He studied it the way he studied quarterly reports, looking for data, for patterns, for explanations. The glass house, the crowd, the phone. His phone? Calder set down his scotch and pressed his palms against the desk. He didn't want to think about Aspen, about the house they'd rented for the holidays, about the argument that started over something stupid and escalated into something unforgivable. But the drawing pulled him back anyway. It was December, almost a year ago. Snow covered the mountains outside the windows. Inside, the house was warm, expensive, and full of tension that had been building for months. His wife Caroline wanted him home more, wanted him present, wanted him to see Thomas's school play, to eat dinner at a reasonable hour, to stop checking his phone every 12 minutes. Calder wanted her to understand that building an empire required sacrifice, that their lifestyle, the private schools and vacation homes and security, all of it came from his refusal to slow down. They'd had versions of this argument dozens of times. But that night in Aspen, something broke. Caroline's voice rose. You're going to miss his entire childhood. Calder's voice rose to match. I'm building his future. He doesn't need a future. He needs a father. He has a father, one who works so he doesn't have to. The argument spiraled. Words they couldn't take back. Accusations that lived in the space between them for months finally spoken out loud. And then Thomas appeared in the doorway, 8 years old, wearing pajamas with dinosaurs on them, tears streaming down his face. Stop, Thomas screamed. Just stop. They'd both frozen. Caroline moved toward him. Calder checked his phone, a reflex he didn't even notice. Thomas ran to his room. Caroline followed him, stayed with him until he fell asleep, then came back downstairs. She told Calder she was done with the arguments, done with being second to his work, done with watching their son learn that love came with conditions. She said she was driving to Denver in the morning to stay with her sister, that she needed space to think, that maybe they both did. Calder said fine, said he had calls to make anyway, said they'd talk when emotions weren't running so high. He went to his office and answered emails until 2 in the morning. Caroline left at dawn. The roads were icy. A semi-truck jackknifed on Interstate 70 near Georgetown. Caroline's car went off the road. The coroner said she died instantly. Thomas never spoke again. Not at the funeral. Not on the flight back to New York. Not when Calder hired the first therapist or the 10th. Calder told himself it was grief, trauma, a normal response to losing a mother suddenly. He never let himself think it might be guilt. That Thomas believed his scream had caused the argument to end. That his voice had driven his mother away, that speaking had broken their family and cost him everything. Until a janitor who'd lost everything himself looked at a drawing and saw what everyone else had missed. Calder stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city that never stopped moving. He'd built his empire on control, on the belief that every problem had a solution if you threw enough resources at it. But his son wasn't a problem to be solved. He was a child drowning in guilt that wasn't his to carry. And Calder had been too busy, too distant, too convinced of his own certainty to see it. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. Book a flight to Chicago. First thing tomorrow morning. What's the purpose of the trip? Calder closed his eyes. I need to talk to someone who knows how to tell the truth. The auditorium at Hawthorne Ridge Preparatory Academy smelled like old wood and stage curtains that hadn't been washed in years. Empty rows of seats faced a stage where students performed plays about historical figures and mathematical concepts turned into musicals. Michael West sat in the third row, hands folded in his lap, waiting. He'd received the message that morning. Calder Norton wanted to meet. Not at his office, not at the school administration building. Here, in the auditorium, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Michael arrived 15 minutes early. He'd learned a long time ago that powerful people like to make others wait, but he refused to give Calder that advantage. At exactly 2 o'clock, the rear doors opened. Calder Norton walked down the center aisle, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost 3 months of Michael's former salary. His shoes made sharp sounds against the floor. His face was carefully controlled, the expression of a man who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals and never showed weakness. He stopped at the row where Michael sat. "You're the janitor," Calder said. Not a question. A statement that carried judgment in every syllable. "I was," Michael said. "Your school fired me yesterday." "I know. I ordered it." Michael nodded slowly. "Then why am I here?" Calder sat down 2 seats away, maintaining distance. "I read your email. I want to know what you meant." "I think you already know." "I'm not paying you to think. I'm asking you to explain." Michael turned to face him directly. "You're not paying me at all, Mr. Norton. So I'm going to tell you the truth whether you want to hear it or not." Something flickered across Calder's face. Surprise, maybe, or anger. He wasn't used to people speaking to him this way. "Your son believes his voice killed his mother," Michael said quietly. "He screamed at you and Caroline to stop fighting. Hours later, she was dead. In his mind, those 2 things are connected, cause and effect. He spoke, and someone he loved disappeared. So he stopped speaking because he's terrified it will happen again." Calder's jaw tightened. "That's not rational." "He's 8 years old. Rational doesn't matter. What matters is what he believes." The therapists never said anything about this, because they were trying to fix the silence. I was trying to understand it. There's a difference. Calder stood up, paced to the edge of the stage, turned back. "You don't know anything about my family. You sat with him for what? 20 minutes total? And you think you understand something that doctors with decades of experience missed. I understand what it looks like when a child is carrying guilt that belongs to someone else." The words hung in the air between them. Calder's voice dropped, dangerous and low. "Careful. You asked for the truth, Mr. Norton. I'm giving it to you. My son's silence has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with you." Michael stood now, facing him across the empty rows. 2 men from completely different worlds, separated by money and power and every measure of social hierarchy. But in that moment, none of it mattered. "Thomas drew you as a giant," Michael said. "Too tall to reach him, holding a phone instead of offering a hand. He doesn't think you're absent because you're busy. He thinks you're unreachable because he's not worth reaching for." "That's not true." "Then why hasn't he spoken to you in 9 months?" "Because he's traumatized. He's terrified. There's a difference." Calder's control cracked. "I've given him everything, the best schools, the best doctors, everything money can buy. Except the one thing he actually needs." "Which is what?" "You. Present. Without conditions. Without checking your phone. Without treating him like a problem that needs solving instead of a child who needs his father." Calder turned away, hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand what it takes to build what I've built." "You're right. I don't. But I understand what it costs." The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. When Calder spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I was on a call when she left. I didn't even say goodbye. I just let her walk out the door because I was annoyed and I thought we'd talk later." His shoulders shook. "There wasn't a later." Michael said nothing. Some confessions didn't need responses. Calder sat down heavily in the nearest seat. The carefully built armor of control and power and certainty collapsed. He put his face in his hands. "He screamed at us to stop," Calder said, "and I checked my phone. What kind of father does that? The kind who's about to become a better one." Calder looked up, eyes red. For the first time in the conversation, he asked a question instead of making a demand. "How do I fix this?" Michael sat down beside him. "You start by sitting on the floor," he said, "and you wait." The auditorium doors opened at 9:15 in the morning. Thomas Norton stood in the entrance, backlit by the hallway fluorescents, small and uncertain. He wore his school uniform, the blue polo and khaki pants that made every student look identical. His hands were clenched at his sides. Michael West sat in the 3rd row, the same seat as yesterday. He'd arrived at 8:30, told the front office he had permission to be there, and waited. Calder Norton sat 3 seats away. He'd flown back from New York at 6 that morning. He hadn't slept. His suit was the same one from yesterday, now wrinkled. His tie was loosened. He looked like a man who'd spent the night confronting truths he'd avoided for 9 months. Thomas saw them both. He didn't run, didn't retreat. He walked down the center aisle slowly, each step deliberate, like he was crossing a distance far greater than 50 feet of auditorium floor. He stopped at the row where they sat. Michael didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't move. Calder started to stand, instinct telling him to go to his son, but Michael's hand came up slightly, a small gesture. Wait. Thomas looked at Michael, then at the empty seat beside him. He sat down. The silence stretched out. 1 minute, 2. The air felt impossibly heavy, like the room was holding its breath. Thomas's hands were shaking. His mouth opened slightly, closed, opened again. Michael stayed perfectly still, and then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, so quiet it almost disappeared into the space between them, Thomas spoke. It wasn't my fault, was it? 4 words. 9 months of silence, broken by 4 words that carried the weight of a child's entire world. Michael turned to look at him. His eyes were steady, kind, patient. No, Michael said. It wasn't your fault. Thomas's breath hitched. But I yelled. I told them to stop. And then she left. She left because she was hurt and needed space. Not because of anything you said. But if I hadn't screamed, then they still would have fought. Adults make their own choices, Thomas. You didn't cause what happened. You were just a kid trying to make things better. Thomas's voice cracked. She died, and I never got to say sorry. You don't have anything to be sorry for. But I do. The words came faster now, like something breaking open. I was so scared they'd get divorced and it would be my fault, and then she died. And I thought maybe if I never talked again, then nothing else bad would happen, and I tried so hard to stay quiet, but it hurt, and I didn't know what to do. The sentences tumbled out, 9 months of trapped words flooding through the cracks. Thomas's whole body shook. Tears ran down his face. His breathing came in gasps between phrases. Michael didn't interrupt, didn't try to stop him, didn't tell him it was okay. He just listened. When Thomas finally stopped, exhausted and shaking, Michael spoke quietly. You've been carrying something that was never yours to carry, he said. Your mum's accident wasn't caused by an argument. It was caused by ice and bad timing and circumstances no one could control. Your voice didn't break anything, Thomas, but your silence was breaking you. Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I miss her. I know. I miss her so much. That's not going to go away. But it becomes survivable. I promise. Thomas looked at his father for the first time. Calder Norton sat perfectly still, tears streaming down his face, not bothering to hide them, not reaching for his phone, not looking away. Just there, present, witnessing his son's pain without trying to fix it. Dad? Thomas's voice was small. Calder moved to the seat directly beside his son. He didn't pull him into a hug, didn't overwhelm him. He just sat close enough that their shoulders touched. I'm here, Calder said. I'm so sorry I wasn't before, but I'm here now. Thomas leaned against him. They sat like that for a long time, father and son, while Michael quietly stood and walked to the back of the auditorium to give them space. Before he left, Thomas called out, Michael? Michael turned. Thank you for sitting with me. Michael nodded once. Any time. 2 weeks later, Thomas transferred to a smaller school in Evanston. Not because he was running away, because he wanted a fresh start where nobody knew him as the silent Norton boy. On his last day at Hawthorne Ridge, he walked through the East Wing hallway one more time. The floor gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but the silence that had filled it for 9 months was finally, completely, gone. 6 months after Thomas Norton spoke his first words in 9 months, 3 trauma recovery centers opened across the Midwest. The first was in Chicago, in a renovated brownstone on the south side, where children from underfunded schools could receive therapy without their families going bankrupt. The waiting room had comfortable chairs, books on shelves, and windows that let in natural light. It didn't look institutional. It looked like someone cared. The second opened in Cleveland, in a neighborhood where steel mills had once provided jobs and now provided only memories. The center offered family therapy, play therapy, and trauma counseling to children whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't afford private care. Every session was free. Every therapist was trained to recognize the difference between defiance and survival. The third was in rural Indiana, in a county where the nearest mental health provider was 40 miles away, and most families had no way to get there. The center operated out of a mobile unit that traveled to schools, community centers, and churches, bringing help to children instead of asking them to find it. None of the centers carried the Norton name. No plaques on the walls, no press releases, no interviews with news outlets about billionaire philanthropy. The funding came through an anonymous trust that paid therapists competitive salaries, covered operating costs, and made sure no child was ever turned away because their family couldn't pay. Calder Norton wrote the checks, but he didn't take credit. This wasn't about his legacy. It was about his son's survival, and all the other children who needed someone to sit beside them and wait. When Calder offered Michael West a check with 6 figures on it, Michael refused. They met in a coffee shop in Evanston, not an office or a boardroom. Just 2 men drinking coffee while rain fell outside the windows. "Take the money," Calder said. "You lost everything because you told the truth. Let me help you rebuild." Michael shook his head. "I don't want your money." "Then what do you want?" "I want my license back." Calder leaned forward. "That's going to take lawyers, appeals, time." "I know. I can make it happen." "Then do that instead." It took 8 months, 4 attorneys, and testimonies from 3 families whose children Michael had helped in Pennsylvania. The state licensing board reviewed his case, acknowledged that his whistleblowing had been protected under law, and reinstated his license in April. Michael West, licensed family therapist, opened a small practice in Evanston in May. He saw clients 3 days a week, charged on a sliding scale, turned no one away. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, Thomas Norton came to see him, not as a patient, as a visitor. Thomas was 9 now, taller, speaking in full sentences that came easily. He attended a school where nobody knew about his silence, where he was just another kid who liked soccer and hated spelling tests. He brought Michael a drawing, not the one from before, the glass house and the faceless crowd. This one showed 2 people sitting on a floor, backs against lockers. No words, no explanation needed. "I wanted you to have this," Thomas said. Michael took it carefully. "Thank you. My dad says you're helping a lot of kids now." "I'm trying." "That's good." Thomas hesitated. "I still think about that morning sometimes, when you sat with me." "Me too. I didn't think anyone would ever understand." "Someone always will. You just have to wait for them to show up." Thomas smiled, a real one, and hugged Michael before leaving. Michael framed the drawing and hung it in his office, next to his license. That evening, Michael drove past Hawthorne Ridge Preparatory Academy. He wasn't supposed to be there. He didn't work there anymore, but he wanted to see it one more time. He parked across the street and walked to the East Wing entrance. The hallway looked exactly the same, lockers lining the walls, fluorescent lights humming overhead, floor polished to a shine. But it felt different. The silence that had once filled this space, heavy and suffocating and full of a child's unspoken pain, was gone. In its place was the sound of students talking, laughing, living their lives in the unconscious freedom of being heard. Kirby Dane, the new janitor, pushed a yellow cart down the hall. He nodded at Michael as he passed. Michael nodded back. He stood there for a moment, remembering the morning he'd sat beside a silent boy and waited, remembering the decision that cost him his job but gave a child his voice back. Money hadn't saved Thomas Norton. Credentials hadn't saved him. Presence had. The simple, revolutionary act of sitting beside someone and believing their pain was real. Michael walked back to his car as the sun set over the Illinois suburbs, casting long shadows across parking lots and playing fields. Somewhere in Evanston, Thomas was doing homework. Somewhere in Chicago, a child was speaking for the first time in months. Somewhere in Cleveland, a parent was learning that trauma had a name and treatment had a path. The floor in that hallway gleamed under the lights. But what mattered most wasn't the shine. It was that nobody sat there alone anymore, trapped in a silence the world had decided to ignore. Humanity had shown up, and sometimes that's all it takes to change everything.